Imagine a single aircraft landing at a desert airbase that changes the calculus of an entire region overnight. Not a war, not a strike, a positioning. If the United States moved its most feared bunker-buster-capable bomber assets into range of Iran's most heavily fortified underground facilities, what would actually happen in the hours and days that followed? This is not a report of something that has happened. This is a scenario. But it is a scenario that defense planners in Washington, Tehran, and every capital across the Gulf have already gamed out in detail. Because the moment a weapon like this moves into position, it stops being a diplomatic signal and starts being a countdown clock that everyone in the region can see ticking. Let's walk through exactly how this would unfold, piece by piece, and why the answer matters more than any single strike ever could. To understand why a scenario like this would matter, you first have to understand what actually makes this particular weapon so feared in the first place. It isn't feared because of its size, although it is enormous. It's feared because of what it's specifically designed to defeat. Deeply buried, hardened underground facilities, the exact kind of infrastructure Iran has spent 2 decades constructing to protect its most sensitive nuclear and missile programs from exactly this scenario. Analysts who track Iran's underground construction have long noted that its most critical sites are buried under mountains, reinforced with layers of concrete designed to survive anything short of this specific class of weapon. If this bomb were moved into forward position near Iran, it wouldn't be read in Tehran as a routine deployment. It would be read as a direct, unmistakable message. The one type of defense Iran has spent the most money and the most years building is no longer guaranteed to work. So why would this scenario happen now, at this specific moment? The answer lies in a pattern of escalating rhetoric and intelligence assessments that have been building for months. Reports have repeatedly suggested that Iran's uranium enrichment activity has continued to advance despite diplomatic pressure, and that certain underground facilities have been expanded specifically to house next-generation centrifuge arrays deeper underground than before. In this scenario, U.S. military planners would have concluded that diplomatic pressure alone was no longer sufficient to keep pace with that underground expansion, and that a visible show of force, one specifically tailored to defeat exactly the kind of facility Iran has been building, was the only signal credible enough to change Tehran's calculations. The logic becomes simple. Sanctions can be absorbed slowly over years. A bomber capable of reaching your most protected facility within hours cannot be absorbed. It has to be answered. Now picture the human layer of this, because that's what would make the story land with real weight. Picture an engineer working the night shift at one of these underground facilities, someone who has spent years of his career convinced the mountain above him made his work untouchable. Now hearing whispers from colleagues about what's been spotted on satellite trackers and aviation forums thousands of miles away. Picture a family living in a small town near one of these mountain facilities, people who have no direct connection to the program at all, quietly wondering for the first time in years whether living near a strategic site makes their home a target. This isn't footage from an actual event. It's the kind of human reality that has surfaced in past periods of heightened tension around Iran's nuclear sites, and it's exactly the kind of scene that would repeat if a scenario like this became real. Most people living near sites like this have no say in the geopolitics playing out above their heads. They just have to live with the consequences of decisions made in rooms they'll never see. But let's zoom out, because this is where the real story would unfold. Not at a single airbase, but across the entire logistical chain that would need to move into place to make a deployment like this credible. If you trace how a weapon system like this actually gets positioned for use, it doesn't happen quietly. It requires forward basing agreements with regional partners, extensive air-to-air refueling support, and fighter escort coordination, none of which can be hidden from satellite imagery or open-source flight tracking for very long. In this scenario, the most likely staging ground wouldn't be inside Iran's immediate neighborhood at all, but a secure, established American or Allied airbase capable of supporting this kind of aircraft, someplace like Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, far enough from Iran to reduce immediate vulnerability, but positioned precisely to allow a strike package to reach Iranian airspace within a single extended mission window. This is the detail every serious analyst watching this kind of scenario would focus on first, because the choice of staging location tells you almost everything about how seriously the deployment should be taken. This is where the scenario would escalate from a military posture story into a full regional crisis, because a deployment like this cannot be hidden and isn't meant to be. Publicly visible positioning is, in this context, the entire point. A deterrent only works if the other side knows it's there. In this hypothetical, expect Iranian state television to respond within hours, framing the deployment as proof of American aggression and using it to rally domestic political support around a narrative of resistance against outside pressure, even while privately, Iran's military and intelligence leadership would be running their own urgent assessments of exactly how exposed their most critical facilities have suddenly become and what options remain to protect them. Which brings us to the country that would be forced into the most immediate and uncomfortable position. Whichever regional partner hosts the forward staging elements that support a deployment like this, Gulf states that maintain security cooperation agreements with Washington, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, would find themselves suddenly exposed to exactly the kind of retaliatory risk they've spent years trying to avoid. In this scenario, expect these governments to quietly seek private assurances from Washington about the scope and duration of the deployment, while publicly saying as little as possible, because none of them want to be seen by their own populations, or by Tehran as an active launching point for a strike that hasn't actually happened and that they'd prefer never does. From there, the pressure would move directly into Israel's calculations, because no scenario involving Iran's nuclear infrastructure unfolds in a vacuum separate from Israeli security planning. Israel has spent years publicly and privately signaling that it views Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, and has previously conducted extensive military planning around exactly the kind of hardened targets this weapon is designed to defeat. In this scenario, expect Israeli officials to react to the deployment with carefully calibrated public statements, welcoming the show of resolve while continuing to press, through both public and back-channel diplomacy, for assurances that the capability would actually be used if diplomatic and economic pressure continued to fail. For Israeli planners, a deployment like this represents both reassurance and a test, proof that Washington retains the capability, paired with an open question about whether it retains the political will to use it. Now the picture widens again, because a scenario like this cannot stay contained to the Gulf and Israel alone. It pulls in every major power, currently competing for influence and stability in the broader region. Russia, already deeply invested in its military and technological relationship with Iran, would face an uncomfortable choice in this scenario: publicly condemn the deployment as reckless escalation, which costs Moscow little and plays well with its own domestic audience, while privately calculating whether this represents a genuine shift in American resolve or simply another cycle of pressure that will eventually ease, the same pattern that has repeated multiple times over the past decade of tension between Washington and Tehran. China's position in this scenario would be shaped primarily through the lens of economic exposure rather than military alliance. Beijing purchases a significant share of Iranian oil exports and has deepened its broader economic relationship with Tehran specifically because it offers discounted energy outside the reach of Western sanctions enforcement. In this hypothetical, expect Chinese officials to call for restraint from all sides, framing the deployment as destabilizing to global energy markets. Rather than taking an explicit position on the underlying nuclear dispute, a diplomatic posture Beijing has used consistently in past Middle East flashpoints where its economic interests were at stake, but its direct security interests were not. This is where the scenario reaches its most dangerous inflection point, because you'd now have multiple governments running parallel calculations, each shaped by a different threshold for what would actually trigger the next step. Washington would be calculating whether the deployment alone is sufficient deterrence, or whether Iran's continued enrichment activity will eventually force an actual decision about use. Tehran would be calculating whether to accelerate hardening and dispersal of its most sensitive materials in response, moving centrifuges and enriched material to smaller, harder-to-target locations, a strategy Iran has reportedly already practiced on a limited scale during past periods of heightened tension, and regional partners on both sides would be calculating how much political and physical risk they're willing to absorb simply by hosting or tolerating the forces involved. Military analysts, who study exactly this kind of extended deterrence standoff, point to a specific danger baked into scenarios like this one. The risk isn't usually in the deployment itself, which is a slow, visible, deliberately public action specifically designed to avoid surprise. The risk is in the uncertainty period that follows, the days or weeks where neither side is entirely sure what would actually trigger the other into action. A miscalculated Iranian response, an attempt to disperse or harden facilities that gets misread by American intelligence as preparation for a nuclear breakout, could turn a deterrence posture into a strike decision faster than either side originally intended. Let's talk about what continued positioning would actually look like in practice over the following weeks, because this is the part scenarios like this often skip past in dramatized retellings. It would not resemble a single dramatic countdown. It would look almost procedural. Additional aerial refueling tankers quietly repositioned to support extended range operations, satellite imagery analysts at open-source intelligence outlets publishing steady updates tracking aircraft movements, diplomatic cables circulating between capitals, trying to establish exactly what conditions would need to be met for the weapon to actually be used, rather than simply staged. The tension in a scenario like this wouldn't come from a single dramatic moment. It would come from the accumulating weight of a deterrent sitting visibly in place, week after week, with everyone involved trying to read whether it's a bluff or a genuine final warning. Inside Iran, the political fallout from a scenario like this would move through the government's most sensitive internal debates. Iranian leadership has historically been divided between factions that favor continued negotiation to ease sanctions pressure and hardline factions that view any concession under military threat as an unacceptable capitulation. In this hypothetical, expect this specific deployment to sharpen that internal divide considerably, with reformist voices likely arguing that renewed diplomatic engagement is now urgently necessary to avoid catastrophe, while hardline voices, particularly within the Revolutionary Guard, would likely argue that any sign of backing down under pressure would be read internationally as weakness, inviting even more aggressive posturing in the future. Which raises the question every strategist eventually has to answer in a scenario like this: what would actually need to happen for this deployment to move from deterrence into action? Historical precedent from past nuclear standoffs suggests the answer typically isn't a single dramatic trigger, but rather a specific, verifiable intelligence threshold, confirmation that enrichment has crossed a red line explicitly stated in advance, or clear evidence that Iran is actively moving toward weaponization rather than simply accumulating enriched material for civilian or ambiguous purposes. In this scenario, expect Washington to maintain deliberate ambiguity about exactly where that threshold sits, because certainty in either direction, that the weapon would definitely be used or that it definitely wouldn't, removes the deterrent value entirely. At the same time, this scenario would force a much harder question for Gulf states caught geographically and diplomatically in the middle of the entire standoff. If tensions continue to escalate with this level of hardware now visibly in play, expect Gulf governments to quietly accelerate their own air defense modernization programs, purchasing additional Patriot and THAAD-class systems from the United States specifically to protect critical infrastructure like desalination plants and oil processing facilities that would be vulnerable to any Iranian retaliatory strike if the standoff ever moved beyond deterrence. This is the quiet, unglamorous side of scenarios like this one. Not the dramatic bomber deployment itself, but the years of defensive infrastructure spending it would likely trigger across an entire region bracing for a worst case that everyone hopes never actually arrives. Step back for a moment and look at what this would mean globally, because that's ultimately the scale at which a story like this would actually operate. Global oil markets, already sensitive to any hint of direct military confrontation involving Iran, would likely see immediate upward price pressure the moment a deployment like this became public and confirmed, regardless of whether a single weapon is ever actually used. Defense stocks tied to munitions and missile defense systems would likely see corresponding gains, a pattern that has repeated reliably during past periods of heightened Iran-related tension. And diplomatic missions from the European Union, already navigating a difficult balancing act between supporting sanctions enforcement and preserving what remains of nuclear negotiation channels, would find themselves scrambling to prevent a deterrence posture from foreclosing diplomatic options entirely. This is also where the scenario would test something bigger than any single weapon system: the broader credibility of American extended deterrence commitments across every region where Washington maintains security guarantees. If this deployment succeeded in forcing genuine behavioral change from Tehran without any weapon ever actually being used, it would reinforce a decades-old doctrine that visible capability, paired with credible political will, can alter an adversary's calculations without firing a shot. If it failed, if Iran continued its underground program regardless, it would raise uncomfortable questions in every Allied capital, from Seoul to Warsaw, about how much weight American deterrence signaling actually carries when a government has already decided the cost of defiance is worth paying. Let's return to where we started. An engineer working a night shift underground, suddenly aware that the mountain above him might not be as untouchable as he once believed. That's not a headline. That's not a missile strike. But if a scenario like this played out the way the pieces on the board suggest it could, that engineer's quiet unease would be one small human moment inside an enormous, interconnected chain reaction. A chain reaction that starts with a single aircraft repositioning halfway across the world and ends up testing the entire fragile architecture of deterrence that has kept this specific conflict from becoming an active war for decades. The question was never really whether the United States has a weapon capable of reaching Iran's most protected facilities. Clearly, it does. The real question, the one no analyst can answer with total certainty, is whether the mere presence of that capability is enough to change Tehran's decisions, or whether some lines, once crossed, can only ever be answered with the weapon itself. If this breakdown helped you understand just how much weight a single deployment like this would actually carry, make sure to like this video and drop a comment with what you think would happen next in a scenario like this one. We'll keep walking through exactly what a moment like this would mean if it ever became real.